She had no idea she was the hidden billionaire CEO's daughter, and he had no idea that the woman he was replacing, the woman sitting quietly at the far end of his family's Christmas table, holding a glass of water she had not yet sipped, was the reason any of them could afford to be in that room at all. Callum Whitmore stood at the head of the table, one hand resting on the shoulder of another woman, and said the words he had clearly rehearsed. "I want everyone to properly welcome Brid. She's family now." Around him, forks went still against china. His mother smiled the smile she had been saving. His Aunt Patricia, who had flown down from Edinburgh for this, began to applaud. And Brid, composed, unhurried, already wearing the earrings that had belonged to Nadia since their 5th anniversary, simply nodded, as though accepting something she had always been owed. Nadia did not look at the earrings. She looked at the centerpiece. A low ceramic vase, white flowers, sitting at the center of a table set for a life she was being formally removed from. What no one in that room could have known, what Callum had slept beside for 14 years without once thinking to ask, was that the company which manufactured that ceramic vase had been acquired by Nadia's family in 2009. That the man who built the company that made it had been one of Britain's most powerful private CEOs for 31 years. And that 11 days from that Christmas evening, the deal Nadia had quietly signed would deliver her something in the region of £780 million. The woman they were replacing was the hidden billionaire CEO's daughter, and she had not said a single word. If you believe that real strength is the kind that doesn't need an audience, this story was made for you. Please like and subscribe. It genuinely helps more people find stories like this one. And drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from tonight? Now, to understand what Nadia held in that room, and why she chose silence over everything she could have said, we have to go back to where this really began. The Whitmore family dining room was warm in the way that rooms are warm when someone has thought carefully about every detail except the people inside them. A fire in the grate, candles down the center of the table. The good china, which Margaret had brought down from the cabinet in the hall 3 days earlier, polishing each piece with a cloth that smelled of the same lavender spray she had used since Callum was a boy. Nadia sat at the far end of that table and held her water glass with both hands. She had been placed there deliberately. She understood this the way she understood load-bearing calculations, not through feeling, but through the simple recognition of what the structure required. The invitation had arrived not by phone, not by text, but through Callum's attorney, a man named Gerald Foss, whose covering letter had described the evening as a necessary family transition conversation. Frances had advised her to attend, to witness, to say nothing, and let it happen. So here she was, 11 days before the close of a transaction that would change the arithmetic of everything, sitting at the far end of a table she had sat at for 14 Christmases, holding water she had not sipped. The room held 11 people. Callum's father, Richard, at the opposite end. Margaret to his right, in the chair she had occupied at every family gathering for 40 years, her posture the posture of a woman who considers sitting itself a form of communication. Callum's sister, Diana, and her husband, Tom, across from each other in the middle. Their 2 boys, 8 and 11, already bored with the formality and negotiating quietly over the breadbasket. And Aunt Patricia, down from Edinburgh for the occasion, who had the sharp-edged manner of a woman accustomed to rooms that quieted when she entered them. Brid sat in Nadia's chair. Not symbolically. Literally. The chair at Callum's right hand, the one Nadia had occupied since the first Christmas she had spent in this house, the one whose armrest she had gripped through difficult conversations and family announcements and the particular exhaustion of years. That chair held Brid Callahan, landscape architect, and she wore it as though it had been made for her. Callum stood. He had the room before he spoke. That was one of his genuine skills, the ability to gather an audience through posture alone, through the particular arrangement of height and composure that made people look before he asked them to. He touched the back of his neck, briefly, and then his hand came to rest on Bride's shoulder. "I want everyone to properly welcome Brid," he said. "She's family now. She'll be joining us from here on." The sound that followed was not silence. It was the sound of a room performing the absence of surprise. Forks set down with care. A murmur of warm assent from Margaret, who tilted her head and smiled in the manner of someone receiving news they had already decided to celebrate. Richard nodded with the gravity of a man endorsing a practical decision. Diana glanced once at Nadia, a glance that carried something complicated, and resolved it quickly in Brad's direction. Even the boys looked up from the breadbasket for a moment before returning to their negotiations. Aunt Patricia said, "Wonderful. Brid, you must tell me. Do you know Edinburgh at all? Callum says you've spent time there." Brid said that she had. Yes, she loved Edinburgh. The irony of this, the audience should know, was considerable. The Aldermore Construction Materials headquarters for Scotland sat at the corner of Charlotte Square and Yonge Street, in an office Nadia had visited 6 times in the past 3 years, most recently in October, when the board portrait that would accompany the Financial Times announcement had been taken. Brid did not know this. Aunt Patricia did not know this. No one in this warm, carefully arranged room knew this, which was the point, and had always been the point. Nadia looked at the ceramic vase. The flowers were white, minimal, the kind of arrangement that reads as tasteful in photographs. The vase itself was low and pale and unremarkable. The Aldermore acquisition mark on its base, a small impressed triangle, the symbol of the Staffordshire Pottery Works Emmanuel's company had absorbed in 2009, was visible only to someone who knew to look for it. Nadia was not looking for it. She simply knew it was there, the way she knew the acquisition number and the year and the 3 board votes it had taken to finalize the purchase. It was information she carried the way her father had taught her to carry information. Quietly, as a foundation rather than a performance. Margaret said, "Fresh starts are such a gift, aren't they? To everyone?" She did not look at Nadia when she said it. She did not need to. Nadia set down her water glass. She placed her hands in her lap. Her right hip ached with the dull, reliable persistence that had been her companion since the surgery 6 weeks ago, and she adjusted her weight slightly, a movement small enough that no one noticed. This was another skill she had developed without meaning to. The management of discomfort in rooms where showing it cost more than concealing it. She stayed until it was reasonable to leave. She said goodbye to Diana's boys, who were the only people in the room who said goodbye back without calculation. She retrieved her coat from the hallway herself, because the alternative was asking someone, and she had stopped spending that currency here a long time ago. She moved carefully down the front steps with one hand on the rail, her cane in the other, and she got into her car. She sat in the dark for a moment. Not crying, not shaking. She breathed in and then out, and the December cold had followed her through the car door and sat with her companionably. She picked up her phone and called Francis Oduya. The call went to voicemail on the 2nd ring. Nadia waited for the tone, and then said, evenly, "It's time. Call me when you're free." She ended the call. She started the car. She pulled away from the house and drove west along the familiar road, past the industrial row on Cambourne Lane, where the Aldermore Construction Materials Regional Supply Depot sat behind a low fence with its name printed plainly on the gatepost in the same typeface her father had chosen in 1994 and never changed. She did not look at it. She already knew it was there. To understand everything that Nadia held in that car, on that road, on that December night, to understand the full weight of what the Whitmore family had arranged themselves against without knowing it, We need to go back. Not to the Christmas dinner, not to the marriage, not even to the moment Callum first decided that Nadia's silence was the same thing as Nadia's smallness. We need to go back to a Croydon bedsit in the winter of 1974, and a young man with £200 and a degree in materials engineering and a very specific understanding of how the world is built. Emmanuel Osei did not believe in announcing himself. This was not modesty in the way that word is usually meant, the performed self-deprecation of people who want to be contradicted. It was a principled position, arrived at through observation and held with the quiet conviction of a man who had studied structures his entire life and understood that the ones built to last were rarely the ones that drew attention to themselves during construction. He had watched companies fail because their founders spent energy managing perception instead of building foundations. He had watched men lose everything because they needed the room to know they had it. Emmanuel had decided, early and finally, that he would not be one of those men. He arrived in England in the autumn of 1974 with £200 in a savings account, a degree in materials engineering from the University of Ghana, and a single contact name written on a folded piece of paper in his breast pocket, a Croydon construction foreman named Derek Oakes, who had been recommended by a colleague of his father's. Derek Oakes gave him a job mixing concrete. Emmanuel took it. He spent his first 3 winters in a bedsit on Mitcham Lane, with no central heating, working days on site and evenings with load-bearing textbooks spread across a folding table, and he did not complain about the cold because complaining was information given away for free. By 1981, he had enough saved and enough known to open a materials depot on a leased plot on Factory Road in Croydon. He called it Aldermore, after the street where Derek Oakes had first shaken his hand. He had 1 employee. He drove the delivery van himself 3 days a week. He kept his prices fair, his invoices punctual, and his name out of any conversation that did not require it. Within 4 years, he had 3 employees and a second leased plot. Within 10, he had the first of what would become 27 manufacturing facilities. He did not attend the opening ceremony of that facility. He did not hold one. The scene settles into something quieter here. It is 2003. Nadia is 23 years old, home for a weekend from the materials engineering program at Imperial College London that her father had encouraged without ever applying pressure. He had simply left a prospectus on the kitchen table when she was 17 and said nothing, which was his preferred method of guidance. She is sitting at his kitchen table now, in the house in Croydon he had owned since 1987, a solid semi-detached on Beulah Hill that he had furnished simply and maintained meticulously. Emmanuel is at the stove. He is making groundnut soup from a recipe his own mother had pressed into his hands the morning he left Accra, and the smell of it fills the kitchen with something that is not quite memory and not quite comfort, but sits precisely between the two. He is talking about a competitor, a construction materials company out of Birmingham that had submitted a lower bid than Aldermore on a Northern England infrastructure contract, banking on Emmanuel's company not having the regional capacity to respond. Emmanuel had responded. He had the capacity, had possessed it for 2 years, and the Birmingham company had not known because Emmanuel had not told them. The contract was Aldermore's. The competitor's miscalculation had cost them considerably. He stirs the soup. He does not look at Nadia. He says, in the same tone he might use to observe the weather, "The man who mistakes your kindness for smallness will always be surprised by your size." He says it once. He does not repeat it. He does not look up to check whether she has heard it. She has heard it. That evening, in the small bedroom that still held her university textbooks and a poster of the Fourth Bridge she had inexplicably loved since childhood, she opens a plain notebook, black cover, university issue, and writes the words on the first page. She does not know yet what she is saving them for. She closes the notebook and puts it in her bag, where it will remain, moved from bag to bag across the years, until it becomes simply a thing she carries the way some people carry photographs. What Emmanuel built in the years that followed does not require sentiment to be understood. It requires numbers. By the time he died in September 2014 of a cardiac event that arrived without warning on an ordinary Tuesday morning, Aldermore Construction Materials Limited held 27 manufacturing facilities across the United Kingdom and Ireland, 14 commercial property holdings in London and Edinburgh, a development pipeline assessed by independent valuers at £890 million, 31 years of steady, invisible accumulation, presided over by a man whose name appeared on no industry awards, no profiles, no shortlists. His title on the company's original articles of incorporation and on every document he had signed since, Chief Executive Officer. It was a title he carried without ceremony, in the same way he carried everything. He left the entirety of Aldermore to Nadia. The will was precise, witnessed, and legally unassailable. His two sons, Nadia's half-brothers from his first marriage, men she had known at a careful distance throughout her childhood, contested it within 3 weeks of his death. The contest was handled by Francis Oduya of Oduya and Associates, who had served as Emmanuel's estate attorney for 19 years and who dispatched the challenge in 4 months without visible effort. The brothers received modest bequests as specified. The rest was Nadia's. All of it. The trust structure Francis had built was precise as the man who had commissioned it. Ring-fenced, separately held, prenuptially protected. The protections had been in place since 2009, 12 months before Nadia met Callum Whitmore at an Imperial College alumni fundraiser, which meant that everything Emmanuel had built was legally insulated from everything the marriage would become. Francis had insisted on this. Emmanuel had agreed without discussion. He had understood, with the matter-of-fact clarity that characterized all his thinking, that the future was uncertain, and that protection was not pessimism, but engineering. Callum, in 2010, was someone Nadia could genuinely love. That is worth saying plainly, because the man he became can obscure the man he was. He was warm in those early years, attentive in the unself-conscious way of someone who has not yet calculated the cost of attention, and he was drawn to Nadia's steadiness with what seemed, at the time, like recognition. He made her laugh. He cooked badly and cheerfully. He asked about her father's company with what she took for curiosity, and when she gave measured answers, not from concealment but from the habit of privacy Emmanuel had modeled her whole life, Callum did not press, and she took that too as consideration. She joined the Aldermore board formally in 2017 as a non-executive director, attending quarterly meetings in London and Edinburgh. She told Callum she was on a committee. He said, "One of your charity things?" And she said, "Something like that." And they moved on to another topic. And he poured himself a glass of wine and asked about dinner. And she watched him not ask the follow-up question and filed that observation in the same quiet place she filed everything. The irony of this, the audience should hold carefully. By the time Callum stopped asking questions about Nadia's life, he had already stopped asking. The absence wasn't new. The absence had been there for years, wearing the costume of contentment. He had simply never noticed, because noticing would have required him to look in her direction, and he had, by then, already stopped doing that. Now the fracture begins. The diagnosis arrived on a Tuesday in March 2019, delivered by a rheumatologist named Dr. Priya Menon in a consulting room at University College Hospital that smelled of recycled air and hand sanitizer. Systemic lupus erythematosus, an autoimmune condition in which the body, for reasons that remain only partially understood, turns its defenses against itself. Dr. Menon explained the treatment pathway clearly: hydroxychloroquine as a baseline, monitoring for organ involvement, management rather than cure. And Nadia listened with the focused attention of someone accustomed to absorbing complex information and organizing it into what was actionable and what was not. She asked 3 precise questions. She wrote the answers in the plain notebook she kept in her bag, on a page behind the one that held her father's words. Callum was in the waiting room. He came in when Nadia opened the door, and he held her hand in the car on the way home, and for several months after that, he was genuinely present in the way that a crisis can briefly restore a person to their better self. He attended 2 follow-up appointments. He researched the medication. He told Nadia more than once that they would manage this together. And she believed him because she wanted to, and because the man who said it still resembled the man she had married. Then something shifted. It was not a single moment. It was a reorientation, gradual as a tide, in which Callum's role in the narrative of Nadia's illness moved from participant to observer to, finally, narrator. He began describing her condition to other people before she could describe it herself. At dinner parties, the kind Callum organized with increasing frequency as his professional ambitions expanded, he would preface her presence with a quiet word to the host. "Nadia's not been well, you know. It takes a toll." The phrase became a habit. The habit became a frame. And the frame, once built, proved useful for purposes beyond the medical. Margaret Whitmore had been constructing her own frame for considerably longer. Callum's mother was 71 years old and had spent 4 decades as an interior designer whose primary skill was understanding what a room communicated about its occupants. She applied this skill to people with the same precision she applied it to spaces, and her assessment of Nadia, arrived at within the first 18 months of the marriage, was that Nadia communicated the wrong things, the wrong postcode of origin, the wrong professional history, or rather the absence of one that Margaret could translate into dinner party currency. The wrong way of sitting in a chair, which Margaret had once described to Callum as a certain lack of intention. She never raised her voice. She never said anything that could be quoted back to her in bad faith. She operated entirely within the grammar of concern. At a dinner at the Whitmore family home in the autumn of 2021, Margaret watched Nadia decline a second glass of wine. The medication required it, and said, with her head tilted at its characteristic angle, "One does worry, Nadia. You've lost your bloom a little, haven't you? I only say it because I care." The table continued. Nobody contradicted her. Callum touched the back of his neck and said nothing. The medication had changed Nadia's body in ways she had made a private peace with. Her face was fuller. Her joints swelled on difficult days. She moved with care, her full hips and rounded arms carrying the particular weight of a woman who had learned to conserve energy without advertising the effort. The narrative voice of the Whitmore family registered these changes as confirmation of something they had already decided. Margaret's concern sharpened into a recurring motif. Callum's "she's not been well" became, by 2022, "it really does take a toll on everything," a sentence that could mean the illness, or the marriage, or both, and was designed to be heard as both. Nadia heard it secondhand, from Diana's husband Tom, who repeated it without malice at a family lunch. The way people repeat things they don't know are weapons. She sat with the information quietly. She did not ask Callum about it. She filed it, instead, in the organized interior space where she kept things that were true but not yet actionable. Then Brid appeared. Not dramatically. She arrived in Callum's professional life first, a landscape architect from a well-connected Dublin family, referred through a mutual colleague for a shared project in Hammersmith. Callum mentioned her once, in passing, and Nadia noted the name without comment. Then he mentioned her again. Then he stopped mentioning her, which was different and more informative. A restaurant receipt from a wine bar on Marylebone High Street appeared in a jacket pocket Nadia was sending to the dry cleaner. Not their local, not anywhere they had been together. A phone password changed without mention. A Friday evening that ran 2 hours longer than the project meeting that had supposedly caused it. Nadia did not confront him. This was not passivity. It was her father's method applied to her father's principles. Collect the data? Do not spend it prematurely. Wait until the full picture is visible before deciding what it means. She filed each piece of information with the same methodical care she brought to an acquisition review, which is to say she trusted none of it individually and all of it together. By the spring of 2022, Margaret had begun describing Bride to Nadia directly. "Such a capable woman," she said, at a Sunday lunch where Bride had apparently been a topic of conversation before Nadia arrived. "So much energy. One admires that." She looked at Nadia when she said it. The look was not unkind. It was the look of a woman making a comparison she had already concluded. Nadia passed the breadbasket and said nothing. It was several months later, on an ordinary Wednesday morning, that she went into Callum's home office to retrieve a phone charger she had left on his desk. The charger was there. Beside it, face up, was a printed document on the letterhead of a firm called Harwick and Bell Solicitors, addressed to Callum personally. A letter. She read the first paragraph, then the second. It described, in careful legal language, the conditions under which a spouse's long-term pharmaceutical treatment, combined with a documented autoimmune condition affecting cognitive function, might constitute grounds for a formal capacity review under the Mental Capacity Act 2005. It was not a filed document. It was a draft. It had Callum's handwritten annotations in the margin. 3 words, underlined twice: confirm medical records. Nadia set the letter down exactly as she had found it. She straightened it so the edges aligned with the corner of the desk. She walked to the kitchen. She filled the kettle. She stood at the window while it boiled and watched a neighbor's cat pick its way along the top of the garden wall with absolute, unhurried confidence. Then she made her tea. What Nadia did not yet know, what she would learn only later when the full timeline became clear, was that Callum had requested this letter from Harwick and Bell in the same week that Nadia had received, at the Aldermore registered office address in Mayfair, the first formal expression of interest from a French infrastructure company called Groupe Vernier. The capacity letter and the acquisition inquiry had arrived, within days of each other, into 2 entirely separate lives that Callum believed were one life and Nadia knew were 2. The irony does not require comment. It simply requires holding. The erosion of words and gestures was ending. What came next was a different kind of cruelty, the kind that uses systems. The call about the bank accounts came on a Wednesday morning in early November, 3 weeks after Nadia had found the capacity letter on Callum's desk and replaced it with the precision of someone who understood that the most useful information is information the other person doesn't know you have. Callum called it a simplification. He used that word twice, which was one time more than necessary, which meant it was covering something. He explained, in the measured tone he used for professional presentations, that their joint current account would henceforth require co-authorization for withdrawals above £500. Administrative efficiency. A single signature created confusion with the bank's new verification system. He had already spoken to their account manager, a man named Peter Dwyer at the Marylebone branch, and the paperwork was ready to sign. It would take 20 minutes. Nadia said that was fine. She signed the paperwork on a Thursday. She watched Peter Dwyer process it with the small, satisfied efficiency of someone completing a task. And she thanked him. And she drove home. and she called Francis from the car park outside the branch and said simply, "He's done the accounts." Francis said, "I know. Your Aldermore distributions are in the Osei Trust account. He cannot touch them. He doesn't know they exist." A pause. Then, "Are you all right?" Nadia said yes. She meant it. The co-authorization clause applied to a joint account that held, at that moment, approximately £4,000 of shared household funds. What it did not touch, what Callum had no instrument to reach, was the separate Osei Trust account at Coutts, on the Strand, into which Aldermore had deposited quarterly distributions averaging £340,000 for the past 7 years. The arithmetic of his control was theatrical. Nadia had understood this before she signed. What she had not fully understood, until the weeks that followed, was how systematically the next layer of the campaign was being constructed around her. Callum told Margaret about the capacity letter in the second week of November. Nadia learned this later, through the particular shift in Margaret's behavior that followed. A shift measurable not in what Margaret said, but in how she said it, and to whom, and with what careful frequency. Margaret began telephoning extended family, not to gossip. Margaret did not gossip. She expressed concern. She called Aunt Patricia in Edinburgh and mentioned, in the context of Christmas arrangements, that Nadia had been having a difficult time with the medication. She said it with the head tilt in her voice, the one that converted observations into facts. She told Callum's sister, Diana, that she worried about Nadia's capacity for the kind of decisions that a difficult period requires. She used the word capacity because Callum had used it first, and because it carried clinical weight without requiring clinical evidence. By the first week of December, the Christmas dinner had been planned in its entirety. Not assembled, planned. The guest list was Callum's family in full. His parents, Diana and Tom, their 2 boys, and Aunt Patricia making the journey from Edinburgh specifically for the occasion. The occasion, as framed to the family, was a gathering to move forward together. The seating plan placed Nadia at the far end of the table. The attorney invitation, Gerald Foss of Foss and Hartley sending a formal letter to Nadia describing the evening as a necessary family transition conversation, was drafted and posted on the 9th of December. Callum reviewed the wording before it was sent. He approved it. The earrings were transferred separately. Margaret had kept them since September, at Callum's quiet request, waiting for the right occasion to make the transfer visible. She gave them to Brid during a private visit to the Whitmore family home, on the 20th, 3 days before the dinner. Brid accepted them with the composed grace of a woman who had been expecting them and understood their significance. She wore them to the dinner. She would still be wearing them when Nadia arrived. On the 23rd of December, Callum stood in the dining room of the house he and Nadia had shared for 11 years and ran through his introduction in his head. He had rehearsed it, not in writing but in the practiced way of someone accustomed to presenting to rooms, turning the phrases until they were smooth. He checked his reflection once in the hall mirror, straightened his collar, touched the back of his neck, and then heard the cars arriving, and went to the door. The dinner unfolded exactly as designed. The family arrived. They greeted Brid with the warmth of people who had been briefed to greet her with warmth. Aunt Patricia asked immediately about Edinburgh. Richard Whitmore poured the wine. The boys were given their tablets and retreated to the corner with the resigned acceptance of children who understood that adult dinners were primarily performances for which they were the backdrop. And Callum stood at the head of the table, placed his hand on Brid's shoulder, and said the words he had shaped over weeks of private rehearsal. What the audience knows, and what the people at that table did not, is that the cutlery they used to eat that dinner, the 12-piece formal set Margaret had purchased from a Sheffield manufacturer called Broadfield & Sons in 2019, a wedding anniversary gift to herself and Richard, had been made in a facility that Aldermore acquired in 2011 as part of its Northern England manufacturing expansion. Every knife Callum used to cut his food that evening, every fork his family lifted to their mouths, had passed through a supply chain that Nadia's inheritance had built, and her father's company had owned for over a decade. No one at the table knew this. Callum carved the roast with the confidence of a man who believed he had arranged everything in his favor. Later, when the family had gone and the plates were stacked and Brid had poured the last of the wine, Callum said, "She didn't even react. She never does. That's always been the problem." He meant it as a criticism. He delivered it as a conclusion. He went to bed that night, satisfied that the architecture of his plan had held, that the evening had landed as intended, and that Nadia's silence had confirmed what he had always privately believed about her. He was wrong about all of it. But he would not know that for 11 more days. 3 days after Christmas, Nadia sat in her car outside a cafe on Chiltern Street and did not go inside. She had driven there with the intention of ordering tea and sitting at a corner table the way she sometimes did when she needed to think in a space that was neither the marital house nor the Aldermore offices. But she had parked and turned off the engine and found that the car was sufficient. The December cold settled around it. People passed on the pavement with their collars raised, carrying bags from the post-Christmas sales, and Nadia watched them without seeing them and held the notebook in both hands on her lap without opening it. She was taking inventory, not of her feelings, those she had filed appropriately, in the same organized interior space where she kept everything that was true, but not yet ready to be spent. She was taking inventory of what Callum had built and what she held in response, the way a structural engineer surveys a building before deciding where to place the load. What he had built? A financial co-authorization clause that controlled £4,000 of shared household funds, a capacity letter drafted by Harwick and Bell, annotated in his handwriting, not yet filed, a family narrative assembled through Margaret's telephone calls and Aunt Patricia's careful reception of them, in which Nadia was dependent, diminished, and requiring management, a Christmas dinner architected in every detail, from the seating plan to the attorney invitation to the earrings transferred in advance, designed to make her replacement visible and permanent in front of witnesses. And, underneath all of it, the assumption on which every other element rested. That Nadia had nothing. That she was what she appeared to be. That her silence was the full extent of her. She turned the notebook over once in her hands. What she held in response was not complicated, but it was complete. A Coutts account on the Strand that Callum had never seen and had no legal instrument to reach. 78% of a company that had operated for 43 years without requiring his knowledge or his approval. A deal valued at £1.4 billion, closing in 8 days, delivering her a personal realization of approximately £780 million after tax. 14 years of board resolution minutes, signed and witnessed, and filed in a storage room at Francis Oduya's offices on Fetter Lane, that constituted the most thorough rebuttal of a capacity challenge that any solicitor in England would ever place on a table. The patience had been her father's gift, and she had carried it faithfully. But patience without decision, she understood now, was not virtue. It was simply waiting. And she had waited long enough, and for long enough of the right reasons, and the time that her father had told her would come, the time when correction was necessary, had arrived. Not because Callum had finally done something unforgivable. He had been doing unforgivable things for years. The time had come because patience without action had reached its moral limit, because the capacity letter existed, because the earrings had been transferred, because Brad had sat in her chair and been called family by a room full of people who had once called Nadia the same thing. because some structures, left unsupported long enough, eventually require you to decide whether to let them fall or to step clear. She opened the notebook. The page was the first one, the same page it had always been. The handwriting was hers, from 2003, in the blue ink of a university pen that no longer existed. She read the line once. She closed the notebook. She set it on the passenger seat and looked through the windscreen at the cafe's lit window and the people inside it drinking their tea, living their ordinary post-Christmas afternoon. And she breathed in slowly and felt something in her chest that was not grief and was not resolution, but was the particular steadiness that arrives when a decision has been made and the making of it is finished. She picked up her phone and called Francis Oduya. Francis answered on the second ring. She did not say hello in the way that people say hello when they are surprised. She said it in the way of someone who has been waiting for a specific call and has kept the line clear. Nadia said, "I need two things. Begin the divorce proceedings and prepare the full Aldermore asset disclosure for the marital estate schedule." A pause. Brief. Professional. Francis said, "The group Vernier closes the 8th. The disclosure lands better after the announcement is public." Another pause. "Do you want to wait for that, or file before?" Nadia said, "After. Let it be on record first." Francis said, "Understood. I'll have the schedule prepared by the 10th. Then, "Are you all right?" It was the second time Francis had asked her that. The first had been the morning after Emmanuel died, in a phone call that had lasted 4 minutes and covered the immediate legal steps. Francis was not a woman who asked the question casually. Nadia said, "Yes." She meant it both times. The call ended. Nadia set the phone on top of the notebook and looked at the cafe window again. Then she started the car. The narrative changes here. It is worth naming. Up to this point, Nadia has been described in the language of endurance, absorbing, containing, managing, waiting. From this moment forward, that vocabulary is retired. She is not enduring anything. She is not managing anything. She has made a decision with full knowledge of its weight and its consequences, and she is now a woman in motion rather than a woman at rest. The distinction is not tactical. It is moral. There is a difference between a person who has been gathering strength and a person who has decided to use it, and Nadia crossed that line on Chiltern Street on the 28th of December in a parked car with a closed notebook on the seat beside her. She drove to Marylebone. Not to the house, to the flat on Blandford Street, the one registered under the Aldermore Property Division, purchased in 2018, that Callum had never been told about because the subject had never come up and she had never raised it. The key was on her key ring. It had been there for 6 years, on the same ring as every other key she carried, in plain sight. She let herself in. The radiators were on a timer, and the flat was warm. The kitchen was small and well lit. She did not make tea. She set her bag down on the table, set the notebook on top of it, and stood in the center of the room for a moment, taking stock of the ceiling, which was plain white plaster, and the walls, which were hers, and the silence, which was also hers. Then she went to the bedroom and slept, for the first time in a long time, without listening for anything. The Financial Times landed on Callum's doorstep at 6:47 in the morning on the 9th of January. He did not pick it up immediately. He made coffee first, in the kitchen where Nadia had made tea for 14 years, moving through the routine with the comfortable efficiency of a man who believed the morning belonged to him. Breed was still upstairs. The house was quiet. He brought his coffee to the table, unfolded the paper, and turned to the business section because he always turned to the business section first. The headline was 4 lines across 2 columns. Group Vernier UK acquisition confirmed, 1.4 billion deal closes on British manufacturing giant Aldermore. He read it with the mild, scanning attention of a man encountering a story that does not yet concern him. Then his eye moved to the subheading, then to the name, then to the photograph beside the article. He stopped. The photograph was a formal board portrait, taken in an office he did not recognize. Edinburgh, the caption said. The woman in it wore a dark jacket and looked directly at the camera with the particular composure of someone who has been photographed in professional contexts many times and finds them unremarkable. He recognized her face. He did not recognize what surrounded it. The title beneath her name, the company crest behind her, the words controlling shareholder and lead seller printed in the measured language of financial journalism as though they were simply facts, which they were. He read the article once, then again, then a third time, more slowly, the way a person rereads something when the problem is not comprehension, but acceptance. Nadia O.C. Whitmore, 78% controlling shareholder, non-executive director since 2017, daughter of the late Emmanuel Osei, founder and chief executive officer of Aldermore Construction Materials Ltd. For 31 years. Personal realization from the Groupe Vernier transaction, approximately £780 million after tax. He called her. Voicemail. He called again. Voicemail. He called a third time, and this time did not leave a message, because somewhere between the second and third attempt, something had shifted in his understanding, and he knew, with the cold clarity of a man watching a structure he built reveal its own instability. That voicemail was not the problem. 3 days later, in a conference room at Oduya and Associates on Fetter Lane, Callum sat beside his solicitor, a careful man named Andrew Prentice of Prentice Claiborne, and watched Francis Oduya place a document folder on the table, with the unhurried precision of someone who has been preparing for this meeting for considerably longer than the other side, has known it was coming. The Aldermore asset schedule ran to 41 pages. Francis walked Andrew Prentice through it without commentary, in the manner of someone presenting information that requires no emphasis, because the numbers perform that function independently. The Aldermore stake. The Groupe Vernier proceeds. The 14 commercial property holdings in London and Edinburgh. The Osei Trust account at Coutts, into which quarterly distributions averaging £340,000 had been deposited for 7 consecutive years, entirely separate from the marital estate, legally ring-fenced since 2009, under a prenuptial agreement that Callum had signed and apparently not retained a copy of. The joint estate, the marital home, the shared accounts, the co-authorization structure Callum had installed in November with such deliberate precision, represented, Francis noted without inflection, approximately 2.4% of Nadia's total post-transaction position. Andrew Prentice asked for a 5-minute break. It ran to 40. When he returned, his expression had undergone a quiet reorganization that Callum, watching from across the table, recognized as the particular look of a professional who has just discovered that the ground beneath his client's position is not what either of them believed. Callum looked at Nadia across the table. She looked back with the level attention of someone who has said everything that needs saying and is simply waiting for the room to catch up. Then Andrew Prentice, in the measured tone of a man deploying his last available instrument, raised the matter of capacity. He used the word carefully. He referenced the autoimmune condition, the long-term pharmaceutical treatment, the documentation his client had gathered, the drafted letter from Harwick and Bell, the annotated notes, the family testimony regarding cognitive effects. He placed the Harwick and Bell letter on the table. He said that his client wished to raise, as a preliminary matter, the question of whether Nadia possessed full legal capacity at the time of the relevant board decisions. The room absorbed this. Francis Oduya reached beneath the table and lifted a box onto the surface. It was an ordinary archival box, the kind used in document storage. She opened it. She reached inside and lifted out a bound stack of papers and set it on the table between the two sides. Then she lifted out another and placed it beside the first. Then another. When she was finished, the stack stood 4 inches high on the polished conference table, board resolution minutes from Aldermore Construction Materials Ltd, spanning the years 2010 to the present day, each document signed in Nadia's handwriting and countersigned by 2 independent directors, each decision dated and witnessed and filed in accordance with the Companies Act, without exception, without gap, without a single meeting missed or a single signature absent. The Harwick and Bell letter sat beside the stack. The comparison required no commentary. Andrew Prentice looked at the stack for a long moment. Then he looked at Callum. Callum was looking at the stack too, but his expression had changed. Not to anger, not to calculation, but to something quieter and more final. The expression of a man who has just seen the full dimensions of what he built his life against and understood, completely and too late, what it actually was. Nadia did not look at the stack. She looked at Callum. She waited until the room had fully absorbed its own silence. Then she said, in the same steady register her father had used when he told her the things she needed to know, "I have been making decisions since before you knew my name." Nobody spoke. The stack sat on the table. The Harwick and Bell letter sat beside it. Outside, on Fetter Lane, London continued at its ordinary pace, indifferent to everything that had just been made permanent in a room on its 4th floor. Andrew Prentice gathered his papers. He said quietly to Callum, "I think we should discuss the terms." The following Friday, at 4:17 in the afternoon, Callum's phone received a text message from Brid Callahan. It was 3 sentences. The final one used the phrase mutual clarity. He read it standing in the kitchen where Nadia had made tea for 14 years, in the house that was now in the process of being removed from his life, with the same methodical precision that characterized everything Francis Oduya touched. He set the phone down on the counter. He did not respond. 3 weeks later, a padded envelope arrived at the Blandford Street flat. Inside it were 2 earrings, gold, a particular style, given originally as a 5th anniversary gift. There was no note. The envelope had been posted from a SW3 postcode. Nadia held the earrings for a moment, then set them on the kitchen table and looked at them with the calm attention of a woman completing a final accounting of what had been taken and what had been returned, and finding that the ledger, at last, balanced. The consequences arrived without drama, which is the only way consequences of this kind ever arrive. Not in a single moment, but in a sequence of small, irreversible contractions. The way a structure doesn't collapse all at once, but settles and shifts. And one morning the thing that was standing is simply no longer standing. Whitmore and Crane Architects lost the Hartley Square development account in the 3rd week of January. The principal, a property developer named Graham Forsyth, who had worked with Callum for 6 years, called Andrew Prentice rather than Callum directly, which communicated everything that needed communicating. The FT profile had circulated among Forsyth's investment partners. The questions it raised, about Callum's judgment, his domestic arrangements, the particular texture of a man who had spent 2 years constructing a narrative of a diminished wife, while that wife was quietly closing a 9-figure transaction, were not questions Graham Forsyth wanted associated with his development. A second account followed within the month. The partners at Whitmore and Crane did not call a formal meeting. They simply became less available in the way that people become less available when they have made a decision, but prefer not to say it aloud. Margaret Whitmore telephoned Brid on a Wednesday morning, 10 days after the Fetter Lane meeting, to discuss what she called the situation. Breed did not return the call. Margaret tried once more, the following Friday. The call went unanswered. Margaret sat in her kitchen in the house that smelled of the same lavender spray it had smelled of for 40 years, and understood, without requiring it to be stated, that the social architecture she had assembled around her son's future had been built on a foundation she had not inspected. Aunt Patricia did not telephone Margaret at all. She had read the Financial Times on the morning of the 10th of January. She read it every morning, as she had since 1984, and she had recognized the board portrait immediately, the woman from the Christmas table, the woman whose replacement she had flown down from Edinburgh to witness, photographed in the Aldermore, Edinburgh office, named as the controlling shareholder of a company whose name Patricia now understood she had been hearing for years, without knowing it. She did not reach out to Margaret. She did not reach out to Callum. She sent a brief card to the Blandford Street address, which Francis Oduya had provided through the formal divorce correspondence. The card said only, "I misunderstood the situation entirely. I am sorry for my part in it." Patricia did not expect a response, and did not receive one, which she considered appropriate. Callum called Nadia once more in the first week of February, not with demands, not with legal positioning. He called in the early evening, from the kitchen that had once been shared and was now only his, and when Francis answered on Nadia's behalf, he asked, after a short silence, whether Nadia was all right. Francis said that Nadia was well. She asked whether he had any formal matters to raise. He said no. The call ended. Francis noted it in the file as a personal inquiry, no action required. It was the last call he made. Margaret sent a card to the Blandford Street flat in the second week of February. It was a plain card, cream, with no printed sentiment. Inside, in Margaret's precise handwriting, it said, "I hope you are keeping well." The card arrived on a Tuesday. Nadia saw it on the hall table where it had been placed with the other post. She left it there for 2 days. On the third day she moved it, unopened, to the recycling. The scene settles now into something quieter. It is an evening in late February. The divorce is not yet finalized, but it will be, and the terms are what they are. And the Groupe Vernier transaction has been settled and recorded, and the number that belongs to Nadia Ose, her name, on every document, has always been Ose, in the Ose Trust, in the Aldermore Board minutes, in the Coots account on the Strand. That number is hers entirely, and has been from the beginning. She is in the Marylebone flat. The radiators work. The kitchen is small and well lit, which is all a kitchen needs to be. The ceiling is plain white plaster. She chose it deliberately when she bought the flat in 2018, specifying in the refurbishment brief to the contractor, a firm called Hollis and Webb on Crawford Street, that the ceilings were to remain plain plaster throughout. No coving, no tile, nothing sourced or manufactured or supplied through any part of the Aldermore chain. Some spaces should be entirely her own. This one is. She fills the kettle. She waits while it boils. She makes the tea the way her father made it, strong, no sugar, in a plain mug without a brand name, and carries it to the kitchen table. She sits, she sets the mug down. She reaches into her bag and brings out the notebook. Black cover, university issue, the kind that costs £2 and lasts 20 years if you keep it. And beside it, she sets the pen. The biro. Ordinary. From a pack of 10, most of the pack now long gone, this one kept. The pen Emmanuel Ose used to sign Aldermore's original Articles of Incorporation on the 14th of March, 1981, in a solicitor's office on George Street in Croydon, before anyone knew his name or had reason to. She opens the notebook to the first page. She reads the line. She does not read it aloud. She does not need to, and neither does the audience, who have been carrying it since Chapter 2, who know its weight by now better than they know their own. She reads it and closes the notebook and sets the pen carefully on the cover. This is what Emmanuel understood, and what this story has always been about. Real power is not announced. It does not require a room's attention or another person's recognition. It is built in silence, across decades, in facilities and depots and boardrooms that the wrong people walk through without reading the walls. It cannot be taken by a man who never looked at it. It cannot be diminished by a woman who tilts her head and delivers cruelty through the grammar of concern. It cannot be restructured by a co-authorization clause on a joint account. It was never in the joint account. It was never in the marriage. It was in the foundation, and foundations do not require permission to hold. Nadia Osei was never hidden. She was simply in rooms full of people who had decided not to look. That is not invisibility. That is patience. And patience, Emmanuel taught her, is the structure beneath every structure, the thing that bears the weight until the weight is ready to be seen. She was the hidden billionaire CEO's daughter in every room she ever entered, at every table, in every building whose walls carried her family's name without announcing it. She was always exactly who she was. The world simply took its time understanding. If this story stayed with you, if you have ever been the person in the room that no one thought to ask about, the person whose quietness was mistaken for something smaller than it was, leave a comment below. Tell us what part landed hardest. And as always, tell us where in the world you are watching from tonight. These stories find the people who need them, and we are grateful every time. Nadia sets the pen on the closed notebook. She looks up at the ceiling, plain white plaster, entirely her own. Outside, London does what London does. Moves, breathes, continues, indifferent and enormous and full of people building things that no one else can see yet. She listens to the building breathe. And she is, at last, precisely where she is supposed to be.